In the summer of 1942, as the Pacific War raged across the Solomon Islands and the Coral Sea, one American warship quietly began to earn a reputation that would echo through every Japanese fleet headquarters from Truk to Tokyo. She was USS Enterprise, CV-6, a Yorktown-class carrier already scarred from the early months of the war, yet still fighting with a ferocity that seemed to defy logic. To the Americans who served aboard her, she was Big E. To the Japanese, she would soon become something stranger, almost supernatural, a ship that could not be sunk. Enterprise had been at the center of nearly every major carrier battle since the first months of the war. She had launched the SBDs that chased the retreating Japanese carriers after Pearl Harbor, supported the Doolittle raid, fought at Midway, and provided air cover for the Marines during the desperate opening stages of Guadalcanal. But by August 1942, she was stretched thin, battered from months at sea, and operating out of fragile forward bases like Efat and Nouméa. Barely enough infrastructure to support a capital ship. Still, she pressed on. When the Battle of the Eastern Solomons erupted on August 24, 1942, Enterprise was one of only 2 operational U.S. carriers in the South Pacific, the other being Saratoga. Hornet had not yet arrived. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and still improvising tactics in a war dominated by Japanese naval aviation. Early that afternoon, Japanese scout planes from the carrier Shokaku found the American task force. Moments later, the order rippled across the Kido Butai flight decks. Launch strike. Dozens of Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers and Nakajima B-5N torpedo planes lifted into the air and began the long flight toward Enterprise. The crew of CV-6 already knew what was coming. The same sound they had heard at Midway and the same sound they would hear again and again throughout the war. The rising whine of enemy aircraft diving steeply from the sun. Enterprise's gunners stood ready at their stations as the ship's sirens wailed across the deck. Planes were chained down, hose teams crouched at the edges of the flight deck. Damage control parties waited below with axes, foam canisters, and breathing masks. When the first Japanese dive bombers broke through the American fighter screen, they came in hard and fast, screaming downward almost vertically. Enterprise turned sharply to port, angling herself to throw off their aim, but the attackers pressed through the rain of 5-inch flak. At 1644, a 500-kilogram bomb smashed through the flight deck just behind the island structure. Moments later, a second hit erupted near the forward elevator. A third exploded close aboard on the starboard side, showering the carrier with fragments. Fires roared to life instantly. Fuel leaked across the deck. Smoke poured into compartments. 74 sailors and aviators lay dead or dying. For a moment, it looked like Enterprise might be finished. Japanese pilots circling above saw the flames and radioed back triumphantly, "Ship burning badly, probably sinking." Within hours, Tokyo Rose announced that Enterprise had been destroyed. Japanese naval staff added the claim to their official communiques. As far as they were concerned, the Americans had just lost their last major carrier in the South Pacific. But below the burning deck of CV-6, something else was happening, something that would define the ship's legend. Damage control teams, trained relentlessly in drills that bordered on obsession, surged into action. They knew exactly what to do. They sealed hatches, vented smoke, flooded burning compartments, jettisoned ammunition boxes, and smothered flaming aircraft with foam. Sailors used axes to cut through warped metal and dragged hoses across areas still glowing with heat. Others sprinted through smoke-filled passageways, carrying wounded crewmates on their backs. On the bridge, Captain Arthur C. Davis barked orders with calm precision, ordering speed reduced, fire parties repositioned, and wounded removed from exposed areas. Within 20 minutes, an almost unbelievable span of time, the worst of the flames were out. Within an hour, Enterprise could still make 24 knots, and by nightfall, the flight deck, though scarred and punctured, was clear enough to recover aircraft. When she limped toward Nouméa that night, trailing smoke but still very much afloat, every officer on board understood the truth. Enterprise had survived a blow that should have killed her. But what stunned the Japanese was not that she survived. Warships sometimes did that. What shocked them was what happened next. In barely 72 hours, after emergency repairs at Nouméa, the battered Enterprise steamed back toward Guadalcanal, ready to launch strikes again. Japanese commanders, upon seeing reconnaissance reports that a carrier resembling Enterprise had reappeared, refused to believe it. How could a ship they had just announced sunk be operating again? How could she return so quickly? How could she still fight? The answer would come in the months ahead as Enterprise endured hit after hit at Santa Cruz, off Guadalcanal, during the long night battles of November 1942, and returned every time. She was not just a ship. She was a message. And to the Japanese, that message was terrifying. You may think you have sunk Enterprise. You have not. She will always come back. By the time dawn rose over the South Pacific on August 25, 1942, the smell of burnt aviation fuel still clung to the steel of USS Enterprise. Her decks were scarred, her gun tubs twisted from blasts, and her crew exhausted from fighting fires through the night. To any observer, she looked like a ship that belonged in dry dock for months. To the Japanese, she was already a corpse. Radio Tokyo broadcast the news with absolute confidence. The American carrier Enterprise has been sunk. Victory is ours. Their pilots had seen her burning, listing slightly, blanketed in smoke. They had watched explosions tear open her deck. They had reported the kill. The Imperial Navy wrote it into the day's official communiqué. In their eyes, the Americans had no operational carriers left in the Solomons. The sea was theirs. But the Japanese had made a fatal miscalculation. They underestimated the single greatest advantage the U.S. Navy possessed. Not armor, not guns, not even aircraft, but damage-controlled discipline. Every sailor aboard Enterprise had been drilled until their responses bordered on instinct. From the moment the 500-kilogram bomb punched through her flight deck the previous afternoon, that training had taken over. It was the reason Enterprise, despite the carnage, was not only afloat, but preparing to return to action. Inside the carrier's shattered interior, the true scale of the damage was staggering. The forward elevator had been blown out of alignment. Aviation fuel had ignited in several compartments. Fragments had torn into ready rooms and pilot quarters. Aircraft parked on deck burned down to their aluminum frames. Shrapnel littered the catwalks like metallic gravel. Dozens of sailors had been killed instantly. Dozens more lay wounded in makeshift triage spaces below. Power flickered. Communication lines were severed. Yet Enterprise refused to die. Below decks, repair parties pressed into suffocating smoke, axes in hand, crawling through twisted bulkheads to reach fires before they spread. Electricians rerouted power through secondary circuits. Metallurgists hammered warped plating back into shape with sledgehammers heated red hot. Flight deck crews began patching bomb holes with wooden timbers and steel plates barely 20 minutes after the flames were out. Every man on board knew what was at stake. If Enterprise left the fight, Guadalcanal, still held by exhausted Marines clinging to Henderson Field, would be exposed. Without carrier air support, the entire U.S. position in the South Pacific could collapse. And so the crew worked with a ferocity born of desperation. The night after the battle, Enterprise still had enough operational deck space to recover SBDs and F-4Fs. The pilots who landed described the sight of the ship, scorched and battered, yet still steaming at high speed, as like seeing a ghost pull itself out of hell. By the next morning, CV-6 was headed for Nouméa for emergency repairs. Japanese submarines prowled the sea lanes, listening for the sound of a wounded carrier limping home. Reconnaissance aircraft scanned the waters for wreckage, convinced they would find the remains of a flat top drifting toward the New Hebrides. Yet Enterprise moved quickly, zigzagging at 20 knots with destroyers screening her from every direction. When she arrived at Nouméa's repair anchorage, the shipyard workers stared in disbelief. The damage was severe, but the carrier was still operational, a testament to the design philosophy of the Yorktown-class, which emphasized compartmentalization, machinery redundancy, and distributed power systems. Repair teams worked around the clock. Welders sealed ruptured plating. Carpenters replaced scorched deck sections with temporary wooden planking. Engineers checked fuel lines and repaired elevator motors. Everything that could be fixed in a forward area was fixed in a frenzy of activity. And then something extraordinary happened. Enterprise left again. Not in weeks, not in months. In 3 days. Even senior officers doubted the timeline, but the ship was ready. She departed Nouméa on August 30th, 1942, flight deck patched, compartments sealed, and aircraft spotting her deck once more. On September 7th, barely 2 weeks after Japanese pilots had sworn they had sunk her, Enterprise was back near Guadalcanal, launching air patrols and strike missions to protect the Marines at Henderson Field.
When Japanese reconnaissance planes sighted her again, the first reports were dismissed outright. Impossible, one flag officer reportedly said. Enterprise was sunk at the Eastern Solomons. But the truth was inescapable. The gray, battle-scarred shape moving across the Pacific was undeniably Enterprise, alive, fighting, and very much not sunk. It was the first time the Japanese realized that American carriers did not stay dead. They might burn, they might list, they might trail smoke like crippled beasts, but somehow, impossibly, they kept coming back. The Japanese would see this same miracle twice more, at Santa Cruz and again during the brutal months of the Guadalcanal campaign, but Eastern Solomons was where the legend began. Enterprise had taken wounds that should have ended her. The enemy had already sung victory over her grave, yet she steamed back into the fight before the Japanese even finished celebrating. And for the men aboard her, one truth became clear. If the Empire of Japan thought they could sink Enterprise with bombs and fire alone, they did not understand her crew, or the relentless momentum of a navy learning, adapting, and refusing to lose. To the Americans, Enterprise was a ship. To the Japanese, she was beginning to look like something entirely else. A ghost that refused to stay dead.
By October 1942, the Japanese Navy believed they understood American carriers. They had sunk Lexington at Coral Sea, Yorktown at Midway, and claimed, incorrectly, that Enterprise had gone down at Eastern Solomons. In their view, American flat tops were fragile things. One or two direct hits, and they were finished. So when the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands erupted on October 26, 1942, and Japanese dive bombers once again hurled themselves down onto Enterprise, Imperial Navy commanders expected the same result. The carrier would be mortally damaged, flames would engulf her decks, and she would disappear beneath the waves. And at first it looked like they were right. Shortly before noon, after hours of ferocious air-to-air combat between U.S. and Japanese strike groups, Enterprise found herself the primary target of waves of Aichi D-3A VAL dive bombers, each pilot determined to finish the job started at Eastern Solomons. As the screaming VALs dove through clouds of flak, Enterprise's helm swung hard over to port, then starboard, the ship heeling sharply as she tried to throw off their aim. Anti-aircraft bursts surrounded the ship in a violent halo. One VAL broke through, lined up the island structure, and released its bomb at barely 1,000 feet. The weapon punched into the starboard side of the flight deck, detonating near the forward edge. A second VAL came down the wake line of the first bomber and dropped its bomb almost directly into the same area, blasting apart gun positions, ripping open the deck, and killing or wounding dozens of sailors. Bomb fragments tore through ready rooms and hangar spaces. Fire erupted instantly. A third bomb from a separate attacker missed the ship by only a few yards, exploding close aboard with a shockwave that rattled compartments from the keel to the bridge. With smoke pouring from the forward elevator pit and the flight deck warped by heat, Enterprise began to slow. Planes burning on deck threatened to send flaming fuel cascading into hangar spaces. Japanese pilots circling above radioed back to their carrier groups, "Direct hits on Enterprise, she is finished." Within minutes, Tokyo's broadcast offices prepared a triumphant announcement. The last American carrier in the South Pacific had been sunk. Their logic seemed unshakable. Hornet was crippled and would soon be sunk. Saratoga was still undergoing repairs from a torpedo hit. Wasp had been lost weeks earlier. The Japanese now believed the entire American carrier presence in the region had been extinguished. But below Enterprise's burning decks, the crew once again demonstrated why CV-6 would become the most decorated ship of the war. Damage control parties, already veterans of countless drills and 2 major battles, flooded into the inferno. Men who could barely breathe through the smoke crawled into burning compartments with hoses. Others pushed flaming aircraft overboard to clear the deck. Welders, wearing shielding masks, hammered down twisted metal while the ship was still under attack. Sailors formed bucket brigades, dragging hoses through corridors so hot the paint blistered off bulkheads. On the bridge, Captain Osborne Hardison issued calm, relentless orders, rotating fire teams to avoid collapse.
sending repair parties to the most critical areas and coordinating with the air group so that returning aircraft had a chance, however slim, to land. And then, somehow, Enterprise continued to fight. Her forward elevator was jammed, her deck pitted with craters, and her crew covered in soot and blood, but she still launched and recovered aircraft during the battle. Pilots returning from strikes on Japanese carriers described the deck as a smoking, burning miracle, a surface so damaged that landing seemed impossible, yet it remained open because the crew refused to close it. Even while listing slightly from internal flooding, Big E continued to serve as the primary flight operations center for the U.S. task force after Hornet was disabled. By late afternoon, as the battered American fleet withdrew, Enterprise gathered up remnants of Hornet's air group as well, taking in damaged aircraft and shaken pilots who had nowhere else to land. When the battle ended, Enterprise was the only operational U.S. fleet carrier left in the entire South Pacific. And incredibly, she was still afloat, still steaming, still launching aircraft until the very last wave of Japanese attackers withdrew. The Japanese, convinced they had sunk her, broadcast the news within hours. Enterprise destroyed. No American carriers remain. But reconnaissance soon revealed the truth. Enterprise, though torn apart, was limping southward under her own power, screened by a ring of destroyers. Flames were gone, smoke had thinned. Even damaged, she refused to die. She arrived at Nouméa once again, scarred and weary, and repair teams immediately began another round-the-clock effort. Patches were welded over holes. Elevator mechanisms were bent back into alignment. Burned deck sections were ripped out and replaced with temporary planking. New guns were installed. Less than a month later, Enterprise was back at sea. The Japanese could scarcely believe it. How could a ship they had bombed repeatedly, first at Eastern Solomons, now at Santa Cruz, return again and again? The answer lay in the relentless training of her crew, the design strength of the Yorktown-class, and the forward repair bases that the U.S. had developed at Nouméa and Tonga. But to the Japanese, it looked supernatural. It looked impossible. It looked like a phantom vessel rising from the ocean no matter how many times they tried to send it to the bottom. Santa Cruz had been brutal. Enterprise had been hit harder than at any point before. But she survived. She fought. She returned. And with Hornet gone, she was now the shield of the South Pacific, the last American carrier standing. She would not be the last for long, but for those critical weeks, the fate of Guadalcanal and the entire Solomon Islands campaign rested on a single battered ship that the Japanese had already declared dead. They did not know it yet, but the legend of the Gray Ghost had only just begun.
By November 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal had become a graveyard. Hulks of cruisers and destroyers lay twisted across the ocean floor. Burning oil slicks drifted for miles after each night battle. Japanese and American ships traded torpedoes and shellfire in a brutal contest for Henderson Field, the airstrip that determined who controlled the Solomons. Amid this chaos, one ship kept appearing on the horizon, damaged, patched, scorched, but undeniably present. USS Enterprise, the carrier the Japanese had declared sunk not once, but twice, refused to stay away. For the exhausted Marines on Guadalcanal, her arrival became a symbol of hope. For Japanese commanders, it became a source of deepening frustration and disbelief. After emergency repairs at Nouméa in late October, Enterprise sailed north again, arriving in the vicinity of Guadalcanal just as Japanese forces launched one of their most desperate offensives to retake the island. CV-6 was still wounded from Santa Cruz. Her forward elevator only worked intermittently. Her flight deck bore fresh scars. Some compartments remained roped off because structural damage had only been stabilized, not fully repaired. But she had aircraft, fuel, and a crew that refused to rest. She took station east of the island, launching cap fighters and SBD dive bombers to shield the Marines and strike Japanese troop shipments.
Her presence helped maintain the fragile American grip on Henderson Field at a time when every bomb, every torpedo, every gallon of aviation fuel mattered. The Japanese did everything they could to remove her. Land-based bombers from Rabaul targeted her repeatedly. Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers probed the task force almost daily. Some came at night, their engines droning through clouds like ghosts of their own. Enterprise's radar teams tracked them, her gunners firing into the darkness at silhouettes lit by moonlight or tracer rounds. On November 13, during the chaotic series of engagements that became known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, Enterprise's flight deck was a nonstop flurry of activity. Her aircraft struck the Japanese battleship He, helped sink transports carrying thousands of Japanese troops, and clawed for air superiority against waves of Zero fighters from Buin and Rabaul. During these relentless operations, Japanese scouts repeatedly reported seeing a battered American carrier operating east of the island. Each time, headquarters in the combined fleet flagged the report as suspect. Enterprise could not be there. She had been sunk at Santa Cruz. But there she was, launching yet another wave of SBDs. On November 14, Japanese bombers found her again. A formation of VALs dropped through cloud cover and dove at Enterprise's task group. Anti-aircraft fire burst around them, but one bomber released its payload at point-blank range. The bomb exploded close aboard near the port side, shaking the ship violently and killing several sailors with shrapnel. Fires were quickly extinguished, damage contained. Enterprise did not break off operations. She continued launching sorties as though nothing had happened. For the Japanese pilots who lived through these attacks, the frustration grew into awe. They saw the same silhouette again and again: the Yorktown-class island, the long gray flight deck, the fighter patrols spiraling into the sky. It became unnerving, a feeling that no matter how many times they struck, the carrier survived. In one radio intercept, a Japanese commander at Rabaul bitterly remarked, "The American ghost carrier returns. It cannot be destroyed." Meanwhile, the Marines on Guadalcanal gave Enterprise a different title: the carrier that always comes back. To them, Enterprise's presence meant air cover for supply ships sneaking into Iron Bottom Sound at night, meant dive bombers hammering Japanese artillery positions, meant Wildcats intercepting high-altitude bombers before they could strike Henderson Field. On November 14-15, as the Japanese made their final attempt to land reinforcements and crush the American foothold, Enterprise's air group was everywhere, bombing transports, hunting destroyers, striking the battleship Kirishima, and turning the tide at sea level. Even with her own wounds still fresh, Enterprise carried the burden of a full task force. Her damaged elevators forced deck crews to reposition aircraft manually. Some planes were repaired on deck because hangar spaces were unsafe. Fuel hoses ran across scorched sections of flooring that had been patched with fresh steel only a week earlier. The improvisation was constant, the risk enormous, but the crew had grown accustomed to operating under impossible conditions. On the morning of November 15, after a night of savage surface combat between American and Japanese battleships, Enterprise launched sorties that struck the retreating Japanese fleet. It was the final blow the enemy could not absorb. By the end of the day, the Japanese Navy began withdrawing from Guadalcanal. They would never again threaten the island with the same intensity. For the Japanese High Command, the message became painfully clear. As long as Enterprise lived, the Americans had a weapon they could not neutralize. They struck her at Eastern Solomons, and she returned. They struck her at Santa Cruz, and she returned. They struck her repeatedly around Guadalcanal, and she returned. Each time they believed they had eliminated her, she reappeared on the horizon, patched, repainted, her deck once again filled with aircraft. The inability to kill her became almost symbolic, proof that American resilience had reached a point the Japanese could not match in 1942. And so, during the bloodiest months of the Solomon Islands campaign, Enterprise became something larger than a ship. She became a myth in real time, forged in fire, patched with desperation, held together by a crew that refused to let her fail. To the Japanese, she was the gray ghost,
always damaged, never dead, always returning to haunt them. And at Guadalcanal, that haunting became the turning point of the entire war in the South Pacific.
By early 1943, the legend of USS Enterprise had become so entrenched that even sailors who had never seen her in person spoke of her with a kind of superstitious awe. She had taken direct bomb hits at Eastern Solomons, yet returned. She had been struck repeatedly at Santa Cruz, yet returned. She had been attacked again and again throughout the Guadalcanal campaign, yet always returned. And in Tokyo, that pattern created a problem. Every time the Japanese Navy publicly announced her sinking, she reappeared on the horizon of the war like a specter. The first false claim came after Eastern Solomons, when the Imperial Navy proudly broadcast that Enterprise had been sent to the bottom. The second came after Santa Cruz, when Tokyo Rose told listeners that the last American carrier has been sunk. And the third came during the night battles around Guadalcanal, when Japanese pilots again reported her aflame and sinking. Yet each time, American radio operators monitoring enemy broadcasts burst into laughter, because Enterprise was still fighting. The Japanese themselves became uneasy. Every reconnaissance plane sent out to confirm her destruction seemed to return with the same report: a damaged carrier, but still afloat. In the words of a staff officer at the combined fleet recorded in post-war interrogations, "The American carrier Enterprise, we believed many times she had been sunk, but always she returned. It was as though she was protected by something we could not understand." Behind this myth, however, was not magic, but a combination of American naval doctrine, engineering, and the rise of forward repair bases that transformed how quickly the U.S. could restore a crippled capital ship. The Yorktown-class had been designed with redundancy in mind: multiple fire mains, distributed power generation, compartmentalization that allowed entire sections to flood without sinking the ship, and machinery layouts that let propulsion continue even after significant internal damage. But engineering alone could not explain what Enterprise accomplished. What truly set her apart was the U.S. Navy's mastery of damage control and rapid repair logistics, something Japan could not match. American carriers trained their crews obsessively, sometimes brutally, in firefighting, patching, watertight sealing, and emergency flight deck repairs. Sailors were drilled to respond instinctively, whether swinging an axe to break through a twisted hatch or crawling through smoke-filled compartments searching for survivors. Officers were expected to remain calm under bombardment, coordinate repairs as bombs fell, and keep the ship launching aircraft even while fires raged only decks below. And then came the repair bases: Nouméa, Espiritu Santo, Tonga, and eventually Pearl Harbor's massive dry docks. These forward areas were miracles of improvisation: floating workshops, mobile shipyards, and engineering detachments capable of repairing battle damage far faster than the Japanese ever anticipated. Enterprise would enter port smoking, scorched, and bleeding oil, and emerge days later with deck patches, rewired systems, new gun mounts, and fresh aircraft elevators painstakingly stabilized. To the Japanese, this speed was incomprehensible. Their carriers required months at Kure or Sasebo for similar damage. They lacked mobile repair units. They lacked forward dry docks. They lacked the industrial flexibility the Americans possessed. But to the sailors aboard Enterprise, there was something else at work. Something psychological. They had built a culture of refusal. A refusal to let her die. A refusal to concede defeat. Damage control teams who had fought through the fires at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz carried those memories into every new emergency. As one sailor wrote after the war, "We weren't saving just a ship. We were saving everything she stood for. If Big E went down, the entire South Pacific fell with her." By 1943, Enterprise's reputation had hardened into something larger than life. Marines wrote home describing how they cheered when she appeared offshore. Pilots from other carriers said that landing on her battered deck felt like shaking hands with history. Her paint was often patchwork, sections scorched black, others freshly recoated. Her flight deck bore long scars where bombs had torn through, and sometimes even months after a battle. The smell of burned aviation fuel lingered faintly in her metal seams. But the scars only added to her mystique. She looked like she had survived things no ship should survive, and she had. Tokyo propaganda officers faced a dilemma. Should they admit that the Enterprise they claimed to have sunk multiple times was still alive? Or should they remain silent, allowing the myth of her death to stand even as she launched new raids? They chose silence. The broadcasts grew cautious. Japanese communiqués stopped naming carriers when claiming kills. The men of the Imperial Navy were left to whisper amongst themselves that something was wrong, that the Americans had created a ship they could not send to the bottom. When the broader strategic picture is examined, Enterprise's survival had consequences far beyond her steel hull. Without her, Guadalcanal might have fallen. Without her, the South Pacific might have collapsed into Japanese hands. Without her, the U.S. Navy might not have gained the breathing room needed for Essex-class carriers to arrive in 1943 and 1944. For months, she had been a bridge between early war desperation and late war dominance. By the end of 1942, she had been hit more times than any American carrier in the Pacific. And yet she carried on. She kept launching planes. She kept shielding convoys. She kept returning to the same waters where the Japanese thought they had buried her. To every American who saw her, she became a symbol of endurance. To every Japanese officer forced to confront her again, she became a symbol of something far more unnerving. A foe whose spirit could not be extinguished. Years later, historians would give her a simple title: the most decorated warship of World War II. But to the men who fought in 1942, American and Japanese alike, she was something deeper, something almost mythical. She was the ship that died 3 times and lived 4. She was the carrier that haunted the Pacific. She was, and always would be, the Gray Ghost.